Folks, Ted from Nerd Immersion here, and unless you've been living under a rock, you probably are aware that Tasha's Cauldron of Everything is coming out in November 2020. You also will probably be aware that there is going to be something called the Legacy System, or however I think Legacy is the official wording, where they're going to be changing the way we look at races in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, and potentially all forms of D&D in the future. We don't know. But the main thing of it is what is it going to do, right? That's the question that everyone has. We've been given teasers and little hints at things from a press conference from Wizards of the Coast and comments from Jeremy Crawford. So I think we have a general idea of what we're going to be getting. But I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper into what I think we might actually be getting based on my predictions, based on some articles and concepts that exist in the past, and then, analyze those comments a little bit further. But first, let's jump into our sponsor for today's video, me. I just wanted to point out to all of you that I have a second YouTube channel that you may or may not know about called Nerd Immersion Plays. Significantly smaller than the main channel, but what this is where I've uploaded all of the recent, I'll use recent in air quotes, gameplay for all of the streams that I've done. So I have some kind of overviews for previous campaigns with links to them. Some campaigns, like my Rod of 7 Parts campaign that I've mentioned, the entirety of the campaign exists here on YouTube. My homebrew campaign, Everin, which episodes 50 to 96 are contained here. The finishing of our Rise of Tiamat series, as well as the continuing adventures. And I think all of our evil games, I think from episode 10 and beyond, and a few other one-shots and things like that. So the only reason I bring that up is anytime I post or mention something about a game that I'm playing in, one of the few times I do get to play, or the games that I get to run, people say, hey, I didn't catch it on Twitch. Are those available? That's where they're available. So back to the topic at hand here. What's going to happen in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything? So we've heard a couple of different things, and that it's going to decouple. I think the main thing is they're going to decouple ability scores from the races. And what I mean by that is they used a lot of the Elfie McElferson comments in all those articles. So a standard wood elf, right, will get a +2 dexterity, a +1 wisdom. So I think what they're going to do in this system is, if you want to, again, mind you, all of these will be optional rules, you will be able to disassociate racial ability scores from a race. So you have an elf with all of its racial abilities, and then basically you determine what the ability scores are. So that might be, okay, I'm an elf that has a +2 strength, a +1 charisma. And now I could maybe build my paladin elf, who's now a strength paladin, and that's okay, right? I can do that. Or if I want to be a dexterous dwarf, because I want to be a dwarven rogue, I could do that by having my dwarf get a +2 dex. That makes sense to me. The standard thing in 5th edition is +2 to one ability score, +1 to another. That's kind of the standard, a total of 3 ability score points. Now, it'll get a little bit tricky because certain races break that. For example, a hill dwarf or a mountain dwarf gets +2 strength, +2 con. So we're getting an extra point. Elves get a +2 to 1 ability score and a +1 to 2 others. So that's adding another ability score point in there. Changelings have the ability to dump all 3 of their points into charisma. It's a +2 in charisma and then a +1 in another ability score of your choice, which could still be charisma, giving you +3. So those are ways to kind of break that. But I feel like that can be easily nuanced away, and maybe they just don't incorporate that. The thing that I think will get tricky is when you start messing with the other abilities. And the only reason I say that that's going to be even entertained is in that same press conference where Jeremy Crawford brought up that list of things. He had said something along the lines of, well, what if your elf just didn't decide to show up for weapon training that day, right? For those of you who are unaware, most elves typically have a form of weapon training, right? Most of them, we'll use our wood elf example, they're going to get proficiency in long sword, short sword, long bow, short bow. That's their weapon proficiencies they get. It's called elven training. So they said, well, maybe your elf didn't show up for weapon training and instead they got proficiency in persuasion or performance, or I forget what the article said. That's where things start to get a little tricky, because it would be pretty easy to just separate ability scores. That's easily done. But when you start allowing people to swap things, that's where I wonder how it's going to go. So is it going to only be something like what we just discussed? You can trade proficiency for proficiency. Like I could trade a weapon proficiency for a skill proficiency, or a skill proficiency for a weapon proficiency. Well, how does that work? Because an elf gets 4 weapons. Are they trading it for 1 skill, or can they choose multiple? Is the fact that they already get perception as a skill taken into account? I don't know. A theory that I have potentially is a point-based system, where the race is pretty much just there for the kind of cultural heritage of the race, potentially, and the physical aesthetics of the race. But maybe it would be a point system, right? So let's say you pick a race, you pick the ability scores that you want, again, optional, right? Race, ability scores that you want, and then maybe you have 5 points. Call them, I'm making this up, right? And then you can choose from a table that shows like dark vision is 1 point, skill proficiency is, half a point, proficiency in 2 skills is 1 point, a feat is 4 points, whatever. And then you can kind of mix and match and change things to your heart's content by, I want to be a human, but I want this, that, and the other thing, or an elf with this, and you build out your race to basically be whatever you want it to be. That's a theory that I have. Things get tricky when you go a step further and think about, well, what about racial feats that exist in the game? Feats that are tied to a specific race, elven accuracy, infernal constitution, and so on, dwarven fortitude. Are those now, is the racial restriction removed entirely, where you can just choose any feat you want? There is no more racial restriction. What about magic item restrictions, right? A dwarven thrower, for example, can only be utilized by a dwarf. Well, maybe that's also removed, and that's like a caveat. Like if you're going to use the legacy system, we recommend that you remove all racial restrictions from feats as well as magic items. I don't know, but I am curious, genuinely curious about your thoughts. Again, obviously this will all be answered for us in November when we get the book, but I want to hear what you're thinking as it stands right now. I don't know if that's going to be too much decisions, but there was an article released back in August of last year by, James Hake, saying on D&D Beyond, reimagining racial ability scores. And there was a lot of things going on with that, and there are some other resources out there. I think it was Drive-Thru RPG. There was like the Culture and Ancestry was a book that kind of also went through decoupling and letting you change things up. And there was also some folks who were releasing homebrew things out there that were also allowing you to, again, decouple things and say, like, maybe your background determines your ability scores. And I think that's kind of how Pathfinder 2 does it. But I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the article and see if how this fits. So Halfling rogues are a classic combination, for example, but because they're an optimal combo for all 3 pillars. Ever since The Hobbit, the idea of halflings being small and sneaky has been a staple of fantasy, giving us prime examples of how one might explore, fight, or interact with people as a halfling rogue. So, it says, on the other hand, class combinations like a half-orc wizard have always been a harder sell. In previous editions, a half-orc's penalty to intelligence made a wizard an extremely difficult choice, and even in 5th edition, the fact that the orc race doesn't get a bonus to intelligence makes it hard to excel as a wizard because you'll always have a subpar spell attack bonus and saving throw DC. Again, you don't have to be a min-maxer to want to have a character that is, does what they need to do well. Whether it be casting spells with intelligence, it would be optimal to have an intelligence boost. So let's look at some character creation house rules you can use to decouple ability scores from race. So it says 1, remove racial ability score increases. First step of this house rule is tremendously easy. Simply remove the ability score increase from your character's race and subrace. If applicable, in the case of so-called monstrous races of orcs and kobolds, remove the reductions as well. Here, there are a few exceptions to this house rule for races and sub-races that are highly impacted by their ability score increases. These are human, variant human. The variant human presented in the player's handbook is the default example of human race while using this house rule. And mountain dwarf, since the mountain dwarf, well, this is kind of something that I brought up, since the mountain dwarf sub-race gains a +2 strength in place of another stat, they gain a new trait in this place, martial aptitude. When you hit with a martial weapon, you roll an extra 1d4 damage, or 1d4 and add it to the damage. This, I guess, is gonna, in theory, kind of cover the fact that you're getting a flat +2 to strength. They're adding it as a d4, so it's slightly random. All right. And then it says the original trait is, okay, so it kind of further... this trait originally appeared in a different form, which many commenters rightfully pointed out was much stronger than a +2 strength bonus. The older version is presented here for consistency. It's when you hit with a great sword, roll 3d6 to determine the damage, or add an extra damage die. This is just adding a d4. Okay, that makes sense. And half-elf, since half-elves gain more ability scores, they gain this new trait. You possess one of the following traits: cantrip as the high elf, elf weapon training as the high elf or wood elf trait, Mask of the Wild as the Wood Elf, Superior Dark Vision as the Drow, or Drow Weapon Training as the Drow trait. So this answers two of my base questions right out the gate, is how do you deal with groups that get a better than normal ability scores? So step 2, reassign ability scores. Since almost every race in D&D gains a +2 to one ability score and a +1 to another, total bonus of +3 should be assigned to all characters. My preferred option is for characters to gain access to improving their ability scores based on the training they undergo to become a member of a certain class. However, while discussing this option with other D&D fans, I found a not insignificant number of people who felt that this would make all characters of a certain class feel too homogenous regardless of racial traits. While I disagree with this take, I've nevertheless presented 3 different options of ways to assign ability scores. 1 is class. You gain ability score increases when you choose your class at level 1. If you gain levels in another class using the optional multi-classing rule, you don't gain this feature. So for Barbarian, you can increase one of your ability scores by 2 and another one by 1. Alternatively, you can increase 3 of your ability scores by 1. The ability scores you can increase using this feature are Strength, Dex, or Constitution. So you could give +1 to Strength, Dex, and Con, or a +2 to Strength, Dex, or Con, and a +1 to Strength, Dex, or Con. You have to switch it up, okay? Bard is 2 and 1, is 2 and 1 or 3, and you can choose anyone because bards kind of are, they are sort of the jack of all trades as this is their ability, so that's that option. Cleric, same thing. Strength, Dex, and Wisdom are your options. Druid, again, same thing with Strength, Wisdom, and Charisma. Fighter is the same thing, but their options are Strength, Dex, Con, and Intelligence. Monk, Strength, Dex, Con, or Wisdom. Paladin, Strength, Dex, Con, or Charisma. Ranger, Strength, Dex, Con, or Wisdom. Rogue is you get to choose. Sorcerer is Dex, Con, or Charisma. Warlock is Strength, Dex, Con, or Charisma. And Wizard is Dex, Con, or Intelligence. Then option 2 is the background. So they're going to say you get these when you choose your background. And it again is determined, they give the options from the player's handbook. So Acolyte, +2 Wisdom, +1 to another one of your choice. Charlatan is Charisma, and then one of your choice. It looks like they're all going to be pretty much 2 to 1, and then another of your choice. But Criminal is Con, and one of your choice. Entertainer is Charisma. Folk Hero is Strength or Dex by 2, and one of your choice. Guild Artisan is Intelligence. Hermit is Wisdom. Noble is Intelligence or Charisma. Outlander is Dex, which is an interesting choice. Sage, only because I played a lot of Strength characters with Outlander background. Sage, Intelligence. Sailor, Strength or Dex. Soldier, Con. And Urchin, Dex or Con. And this is option 3, class and background. The third and final option is combine the two above. When you choose your class, assign a +2 to 1 ability score available to your class as an option 1, or 2 +1s to 2 ability scores. And then when you choose your background, you get the final one. Since some backgrounds in option 2 let you choose, you can choose either of them. So that was an interesting option 2. I thought it would be worth looking into because this was something presented by someone who has written for several D&D books, is writing, almost seemingly weekly or almost daily articles for D&D Beyond, so has some knowledge about how 5th edition is handled, I would say. And then had this concept over a year ago with this idea of decoupling ability scores. And I thought it would be interesting to read through that, and I kind of get that. It kind of makes sense. I like that one of the two major issues that I had addressed at the start were the mountain dwarf and the half elf, and how do you handle those? And lo and behold, they were handled in the article. And then again, to the changeling one, where you could technically take all 3 points in charisma, you could, I guess, in theory, leave it, or just don't give that and make it you just remove that option. They don't get an extra one, and then it's tied to their class or their background, or however you want to do it. And I don't know. I assume it's not going to be tied to the class when we get this in Tasha's. I assume it's just going to be something you choose at character creation. I also can see how this could be a min-maxer's paradise in theory, depending on how much customizability you get. And then it seems at that point, race it exists, but again, it's primarily just, in my mind, for the aesthetics and the potential racial history of that, right? Like whether elves have their long lives. So I guess maybe that's a thing, right? The age category I'm assuming would probably be something that stays the same, right? So humans still live to the normal human age, 75-ish. Elves still live to 500. So I'm guessing when you look at a race in 5th edition, some of that's the size category will likely, I would also think, stay the same. So I'm going to pull up a race. We'll grab dwarf right here. We'll go and look. So I think all of this background stuff, for the most part, will stay the same. The history stuff, the lore, but obviously some of that may change based on what you don't do and don't get. So I think the naming convention will likely stay the same. And then you'll still have your age, your alignment, your size, and probably your walking speed will stay the same. That's what I'm thinking. And then possibly if they do go for full customizability, everything after the fact will be changeable. But I don't know. Some races get an improved movement speed. But I think like base movement speed increases will likely stay the same. Like, right, if your race has 35 feet of movement, you'll probably still have 35 feet of movement, but your additional things that you might get will not be there, right? Like, so if you have the Tabaxi's feline agility or whatever it's called, that could be something you could put on like an elf and it'd be elven agility, which could make sense, And so I assume a lot of people, and I could be wrong, but I assume a lot of people are going to out there, they're going to ask, what are my opinions on this? And I really don't care. I don't mind the way the races are handled as they are in 5th edition. It clicks in my head as someone who's played RPGs and video games and video game RPGs for a long time. The concept that your race gives you certain benefits to certain abilities or stats of some kind makes sense to me. But also decoupling it and allowing full 100% customization also makes sense. Here's the other thing. There's nothing that hasn't been stopping you from doing this long before Tasha's comes out and allowing you to do this without even purchasing Tasha's. You could just go and do this right now with those rules we just talked about, or some other homebrew version of those rules. You could just do it. It doesn't need to be in a printed D&D book for you to make it a rule. Now, it may have some more parameters around it when it comes from Wizards, but I don't know. I like to build characters. I talk about it a lot. I come from a min-maxing background. So if I could really make my optimal character class or race, race class combination by allowing me to switch and move things around, then yeah, I'm all for that. That in theory just added a ton of customizability to the game, because now all of if it works the way I'm saying with points and you allocate, or however that's going to work, take every race that exists in 5th edition that's come out thus far, and now you have a significant more amount of customizability by all of those traits now being in a pool that you can pull from. And again, there's no reason that third-party races or homebrew races that you make can't also fit into this concept, right? You built a homebrew race for your game. Well, now it can be added in to this group, right? Where those racial traits now go into the pool that you pick from. Or you really like a third-party thing from some other company and you can pull that in. So it's just going to add more customizability. It could, in theory, slow down the game if you have new players and you want to introduce them into the game and you say, hey, you get to pick your race, and they say, oh, okay, I'm going to be an elf, and then you kind of have the option to say, okay, here's the player's handbook, you're an elf, pick your sub race. Or you could be like, here's this other book, Tasha's, and now you get to decide everything and you can go to town, have fun, which could potentially be overwhelming for new players. But for veteran players who may want to like, switch things up because they're tired of the normal conventions, this could be a huge boon. It just adds that much more customizability to the game. So that's kind of where I land. I've always said 5th edition's biggest downfall, aside from things like a lack of a crafting system, is options. Because they've been so slow to roll out new books to reduce the concept of book bloat, which, we'll be honest, it was a big thing in 3rd and seemingly from 4th edition. There was new books out all the time, and to stay up to current as far as builds and things like that, you needed to go out and get the new books. So they went hard the other way in slowing down player-based content to very sporadic books, right? We really only have, for true player options, aside from races and a couple of spells, the player's handbook and Xanathars, and now Tasha's coming out. It's going to be our thing. Again, I know there is the different Ravnica and the Magic the Gathering books have other classes in them, but they're all going to be reprinted in Tasha's anyway. And, the handful of people that were left behind in the Sword Coast Adventures Guide. But, it's just going to add more options to the game, and more options is a good thing. That's a good way to keep your game going longer. I mean, there are still people that are playing 2nd edition, probably still 1st edition, 3rd edition, and I'm sure it's only enriched by the number of options that you have. Because even if I'm going to sit down and play Curse of Strahd again, it would kind of be boring if I only had 12 options and so many races. But if now I have a whole bunch of new subclasses and a whole bunch of new races, I could play through with the same group of people, and it could be an entirely new experience because everything is different. And that kind of variability and options in your game is going to extend its life cycle for a significant amount of time for very minimal work, which is why my video earlier, or maybe, a couple days ago, depending on when you see it, about templates, kind of in my mind just made sense because it just adds options and variability to the game, but keys off of things you've already established exist without having to add truly new content. You're just altering things you've already done. So anyway, that's my sort of video on the concept of what I think we're going to be getting in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything regarding this legacy racial swapping of abilities and whatever you want to call it. I guess the legacy system is the name. So let me know what your thoughts are, again, in the comments. Do you maybe have a different idea other than this kind of arbitrary point system that I came up with? Do you think it will be pretty hard set, like you can't be a human with dark vision, or you can't be a dwarf that has elven trance, or do you think it will be truly just go wild and do what you want? I want to know what your thoughts are. Thank you again to my patrons on Patreon for continuing to support me and the channel, and I will see you all next time.